Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ann Thornton, the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the New York Public Library, and I'm really excited to be here this afternoon with such a great panel of folks. And let me make some quick introductions to them, although they don't really need an introduction. Josh Greenberg is Director of the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Digital Information Technology Program. Mara Marks is Deputy Director of the Office of Library Services at IMLS, currently serving as the Acting Director of the Institute of Museum and Library Services. And Don Waters is the Senior Program Officer for Scholarly Communications at the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And we convened via phone to talk about what this session, what we wanted to bring out in this session with all of you and engage you all in thinking about. We also talked about what this session isn't. And so I thought I'd start by saying what it isn't. It isn't going to give you a 5-point plan for getting money out of Josh, Mara, or Don. But you're all still sitting here, and that tells me that you are interested in what they have to say. And I think that what is particularly valuable about their perspectives is that they spend a lot of time in conversation and discussion and listening with folks who are thinking about the big shifts, the kinds of shifts that we've been talking about this morning and hearing about this morning, but in a landscape that is inclusive of libraries, but is not exclusively about libraries and library service. And so that's where we're going to start today. And I'm going to ask Don Waters to kick us off to share some of the bigger shifts that he's observing in the broader landscape that includes libraries.
Thanks a lot, Ann. Somebody helpfully suggested that we all leave $100 bills at the door, but we're not doing that either. And as Ann said, I think it's quite true that what we learn and what we all have to say collectively is really what we've learned from our constituents, you in this room, others in libraries and museums and related institutions around the country, and in some cases around the world. I think it's hard to beat the comprehensive list that Jim gave this morning of high priority questions that need to be addressed. Jim has keeps his own finger on the pulse of these issues and is usually very accurate, if overwhelmingly accurate in some cases, because it's such a long list. And the issues that I will raise now are really a result of the listening that we've been doing at Mellon and in conjunction with a planning process that we've undertaken over the last couple of years with our new president. And that has resulted in a sort of focus on some of the things, because we could do a lot. And even though we have fantastic resources, we can't do everything. And so the narrowing has been that we've agreed within the foundation, at least for scholarly communications purposes, to focus on the potential of the digital technologies to expand and equalize access to cultural and scholarly resources. And that's across all sectors. And I'll come back to the diversity question that was raised earlier at the end. In the spirit of Jim's list, I have just 5 points that I want to draw your attention to. First is national infrastructure, and an area that we have been focusing on, and I know that my colleagues at Sloan and IMLS have also been focusing on, is areas where there are the potential to develop national infrastructure for digital materials, for education and research. The Digital Public Library of America comes to mind as right at the top of that list. The CLEAR initiative on coherence at scale. I think you need to dig a little bit understand the definition of coherence. It's kind of an odd phrase in our world, but the intention of trying to bring together, and I'll just pick out the example of the proliferation of preservation organizations that have occurred over the last 4 or 5 years, and to cohere them into a more understandable array of organizations would be hugely helpful. And then a third area I'll just mention briefly is the so-called collective collection, how we are dealing with our print collections collectively across the nation. And there is, and has been over the last decade or so, a growing interest among libraries in how to do that, how to do it well. And we have a proposal on the table right now that's looking at an issue that I don't think really has been addressed, and that's the issue of verification. If you are retaining these items, how do you know that it's actually on the shelf? And it's not a question that many libraries want to face up to. I don't imagine that there are many that aren't on the shelf, but we just don't know. And it's an important question. Second area is, and I'm just going to briefly mention this, is digital publishing. We've invested over the last year an enormous effort at the foundation to learn from faculty, from administrators, from libraries, presses around the country, and I was on the road quite a bit last year in this initiative, to figure out how we can enhance the quality of digital publication and think of the minimal quality right now that you get out of a PDF and what it could be and how you can get there. And we're focused particularly on the monograph and how that needs to migrate in the digital world. And we've made about 15 or 16 grants in the last 2 cycles on this area. And one of the biggest areas is addressing the need for faculty to be able to publish works that they can't publish in print based on their work in the digital environment, how they refer to sources, how they refer to other related work online, and the skills that are needed to write in that environment, the apparatus, annotation, and so on that is needed to produce quality work. A third area that I'd highlight, I think Jim also mentioned this morning, and that's the area of linked data. There is a number, this is an area of technology that's been around for a couple of decades, and it's only recently, in my view, it's gotten an enormous amount of traction. There are a lot of projects that output linked data now, and not much effort to aggregate those linked data and show what the links do, how they make the world better. But the promise is that we will move away from standards, and especially if we adopt this in our library processing, we move out of the world of library-centric, inward-looking types of systems and play in the network. And I think that's the real promise. And I know some of the staff here at Columbia are at a meeting at LC today to discuss ways of integrating linked data processing in the library environment. I will issue one quick warning on that. There is no ultimate salvation here. The reemergence of the metadata wars are likely to occur, and they already are occurring. You have CDOC CRM, you have schema.org, and you have BibFrame, and they are all competing with one another. And of course, the promise is that we'll just do crosswalks out and the world will be lovely, but I'm not sure that that's going to work out exactly that way. Fourth area that I'd mention is a complicated area in a world where we are so intent on open access. And I will put it this way, we need to be looking at how to deal with restrictions in an open environment. This is an area that we had figured out in the analog environment. We have reading rooms where there's ways and procedures in which we can address the issue of privacy, private data, material that's protected by intellectual property, ethical issues having to do sacred material from tribal societies and so on. And we don't have comparable mechanisms in the digital environment to deal with that, and to deal with it in a way that promotes access to that material and doesn't just hide it away. And there are identity management issues here. Most of the campuses in the US have been working with Internet 2 to build these trust networks and identity management systems. But I'll bet most of the people in this room do not even know who the person is on your campus that's responsible for that. And it's a world that needs to be brought into the library and put in the sandbox, experimented with, so that we learn how to administer access to restricted material using tools that allow certain kinds of people to use the material. And we've got a long way to go there. It opens the door for what I think Susan Gibbons coined as the virtual reading room. And we really need to be moving in that direction. Last area I'll mention has to do with preservation, and it has multiple dimensions here. I mentioned the collective collection. As we aggregate these material in these collections, we need more than ever to ensure that we have expertise for conservation, to conserve those materials. And that is conservation, I'm afraid, is a dying art. And we don't have good training programs in the country for this skill. We've made some progress in journals, in preserving published journals, but not a lot. The Cornell-Columbia collaboration has shown that we have a far way to go there. But the web is still, in many ways, virgin territory, and even more virgin than that is the area of software. And most of what's interesting is that our ability to preserve the web depends on our ability to deal with software, because a lot of the web things we're trying to capture run on software. I do want to mention in closing the diversity question, and I think this is an area that we have, it's an area that the Foundation has been concerned about for a long time in general in higher education, and it's an area that all the programs now are taking a much closer look at. We've started commissioning studies in a couple of our programs, and it's an area that we're underrepresented. People in this country need to be brought into the mainstream of higher education, research libraries, museums, archives, and so on. And it's underrepresented in multiple dimensions. How many of you have been in a technology meeting where there's been more than one or two women? And we need to focus specifically on the ethnic and racial divide in our world as well. I can't say at this point what our ways of addressing this are. We've made a couple of initiatives in my program, but we have a long way to go, and that's going to be another area of focus.
Thank you, Don. Josh, you want to jump in next?
Sure. Can you hear me? Okay. So I had figured I would just spend a minute or two looking forward to the discussion, just giving a sense of how I'm looking at the world and what I'm seeing as, in some sense, maybe not at the level of the items on the tablet, but just the tablet itself. So my program at the Sloan Foundation is really fundamentally focused on enabling scholarship, particularly in the natural and social sciences as the main area that Sloan funds, but I also came out of a digital humanities background before that, and so I'm really interested in scholarship broadly in a changing technological context. And what I mean by that is first and foremost, the ability to generate and access sort of data at vastly greater scale than before, and I mean data in a very generic sense. The need to apply computational approaches to that data in order to distill knowledge out of it, and the ability to collaborate and share over digital networks. I'm a historian of technology by training. I'm very aware that we're still in the very early days of understanding these technologies. It's not that, before the past decade or couple decades, researchers didn't work with data. That wasn't the case at all. But there's a difference in character and scale of what we're seeing over the past, you can choose your threshold, but we'll at least say once people started talking about big data, and we can, if you want, unpack why that term makes me very uncomfortable. So in the context of that broad interest, I've spent a lot of time working with libraries, funding libraries, but doing them, and I think it's an important point, not as ends in themselves, but as means, as important and essential parts of the research ecosystem, but with an eye towards that broader agenda of facilitating scholarship. And the reason that I frame it that way is to take an example. So over the past handful of years, data has sucked a ton of air out of the room. Everybody here probably in some way or another is trying to figure, it wasn't just that the NSF lit a fire under research data management and everybody had to figure out how to deal with it, but that was an important sort of trigger. It's not purely on one end of the disciplinary spectrum. Really on all sides, there's this issue of research data that seems very squarely on the agenda. And so when I came into Sloan almost 5 years ago now, that was clearly the first topic to engage. And we did a number of things ranging from supporting the data management plan tool on the sort of like technology side of the spectrum to helping to support the clear DLF data curation postdocs on the sort of workforce side and understanding the relationships between these different strategies. But what I've come to realize, what I've come to really see clearly over the past couple of years, to pick up on one of the last points Don made, is that if you tug the thread of data hard enough, you realize that data in itself is actually pretty inert. Data is a thing, and if you want to understand how to support the production and extension and dissemination of scholarship, you tug on that thread of data, inevitably it leads you to software. Because in this era, you don't operate on data by looking at it and taking out a pencil, and you're operating on it with code. Those are the tools of 21st century data-driven research, regardless of whether it's in sort of microbiology or economics or distant reading of literature. So once you get to software, you realize that if the library has a role in stewarding products of research, inevitably, I think more and more we're going to be getting to how do you save software, how do you preserve it, how do you manage it, both so that it's an object for future use, but also so that if you want to pick up a study and extend it, you have that material to work with. And I think there's a really important point in this, which is the one thing that I want to say here, before, to start a discussion, which is I think this positions libraries in a different way with regard to the research process. That it's not, and there isn't the sort of straw man caricature that libraries always just preserve the output of the research process. Libraries have been an integral part of research from the very early stages of a research process all the way through, but often in a discovery or in there's a getting people to material, and then at least, and I would welcome challenges to this, but my sense from working in libraries and working as a scholar in libraries is that there's been a hesitance to overdetermine the research itself. That there's a sense of a partnership, there's a sense of a sort of a sense of a boundary. And once you start thinking about preserving software, preserving the actual context of research itself, and you start to, I hear this partly in the way that the word curation is deployed, partly in the context of data. We're starting to hear this in the context of software. Curation is a much more active role than preservation, and I think there may be something interesting to play with in even the way that those terms are used. So from where I sit, sitting up on the 22nd floor of one of the buildings at Rockefeller Center, trying to understand how a place like Sloan can help contribute using the, I always say this and it gets chuckles, but using frankly the relatively limited means that we have at our disposal, it becomes a question of how to help libraries engage in these different ways in research processes, how to help them build different kinds of relationships with researchers, where there's where there isn't a sort of a transactional character to it, but a collaborative one, one of the things that I've found really interesting in the work around data science, which is this really interesting category that I know is very, is a very important topic of interest here at Columbia and elsewhere, is it really is unclear right now what, say, the library's role in facilitating data science research is. And I think there's an opportunity there to help shape norms and to model particularly some more sort of upstream collaborative processes. So I'll leave it with that, and we can pick up threads in discussion.
Thank you. Mara?
It's great to go last, especially after Jim's wonderful introduction this morning, and then my fellow panelists. We're a little different. We're the federal funding agency. So we fund all types of libraries. We're not just focused on research libraries, the academy. So I won't rehash, a lot of the things that you've said are of importance to us too, but some other things as well. And we've changed the way that sort of the mechanism for funding to try to bring in the community to guide us in national priorities because, Don talked about a focus. We have limited dollars. We have a large amount of money that goes out in programmatic funding all across the country, and then we have limited discretionary dollars that we really have to focus on things that we can try to shift, and so we look to you for input. We also recently raised the bar on the level of our funding so that the Academy would come back to us because for a while we had lowered that threshold and we weren't seeing your involvement in what we do. So that's important to us, and I'll just do the plug. We're having a series of convenings this spring, so please speak up during those. That's where we get a lot of our priorities. I was just looking at the notes that I took, infrastructure. Yes, the infrastructure that the Academy has and has built over the last decades. We made a huge investment in that. We also invest in state infrastructure, and they are the largest recipients. The state library administrative agencies are the largest recipients of funding through LSTA. They're also starting to grapple with the data issue. So I think they're looking for ways to work with partners who have experience. So I think we look at our role as trying to bring together these different parties where there could be synergy, there could be that kind of radical collaboration that never existed in the past between state libraries or city public libraries and the Academy on infrastructure. So we think about that a lot. Data. What more can I say? Data management plans are part of what we judge grants on these days. We look at that. People are getting savvy about those plans. They're looking at the life cycle after the end of the grant. The data management plan has to go on way after the grant itself has ended. So that's something that our reviewers, thankfully, are savvy about and are helping us to look at. Enough said. We're also looking at community involvement and participation, as part of all of these efforts. Who is a good citizen? Who is at the agency? People talk about the $20,000 question, and that there's all these things that we can solve this problem if you just pay $20,000 a year, and the thing will keep running. So how many of those $20,000 things are being supported? How do you decide which things are the ones to support? What do you look for in sustainability? How long should those things be expected to live and to function? Those are the types of things that we're thinking about. What else? The development of the profession has been talked about a lot today. We've shifted the way that we fund that too. I think in the past we funded a lot of maybe doctoral not a lot of, very few actually, a couple of doctoral students to go through programs. Now we're looking at how can we maximize the use of those dollars and do things like the National Digital Stewardship, I can't even say the program, it's so many words, but residencies where these are programs where young professionals are given some training and then planted into host organizations where they learn and practice data curation. That type of thing is something that we want to do more of because we think that, and by the way, as I'm saying that, they don't always have to be young. We're interested in taking people and helping to train them in all those ways. No, I mean, that was a good comment that was made earlier today. So Diversity, we support you. And we want to support more. You know, we look around too and we see that as still a problem, and we're always looking and open to ways to bring just more people from different backgrounds into the profession. Two things that don't have to do with the academy. Hands-on and participatory learning. We think about this a lot because we support a lot of public libraries. We like to think there's this great big cycle where all those kids who are playing in the library today are going to come and staff the academic library of the future. And so we're trying to make that experience as much about, again, self-driven learning. What are you interested in? The library will support it in all kinds of ways. We are there to facilitate learning in all ways. So that's just one more trend I think that's important. And finally, Jim's words on information policy. You know, one of the roles of IMLS is to advise the president on matters of policy related to libraries. So we do look for strong voices in the community who can help us think through some of the biggest issues of the time. You know, we're all worried about copyright, but what else? And what are we doing? And what are the actions? So I think that's an overview. Let's get to questions.
Great.
Conversation.
Good, good. Before we get to some questions, I just want to follow up with a question about the big shifts that you've identified, the changes, and the implications and opportunities for libraries. What are some of how does the particular identity of the library within institutions and academia and the core values of libraries that we heard spoken about this morning, how did those play a positive role in dealing with some of the issues and shifts that you've raised? Josh, you talked about curation, and you know, libraries have a commitment to that and to content and context and so forth. But what are some of the other things?
I can throw one other one out that doesn't necessarily directly flow from what I said, but one of the touchstones I keep coming back to in my work. I spend a lot of time trying to think about how to avoid the same wheel getting reinvented in various disciplines, because there can be very high walls, very high silos between various academic disciplines. And from where I sit at in the role that I'm in, libraries are one of the very few and arguably the best positioned trading zone between disciplines. And I use the word trading zone particularly, again, so the historian of science, Peter Gallison, sort of appropriated the term trading zone out of the anthropological literature to talk about spaces between disciplines, places where things like pidgin languages or common modes of exchange can help to facilitate cultural cross-pollination and shared production. And again, thinking sort of in aggregate about the way knowledge is made today and the various systems of professions and disciplines, I think there's a tremendous role for the library, which is sort of geographically and philosophically at the heart of the university, in being an open space. So the openness, inclusiveness, service to all comers, that norm is something we don't often talk about as much as commitment to privacy or et cetera. And I think there's a desperate need in the modern university and the modern sort of knowledge landscape for libraries to really embrace that role.
Great. Good. Don, Mara, anything to add on that? You had
I was just thinking
about
of that in terms of cities, again, because we fund all types of libraries, so we think about that in terms of how a library relates to all of the different institutions in a city and can bring all of those together. We encourage libraries to be much more engaged, to go outside their walls, to bring institutions together. So, yeah.
Great. Okay, let's get to some questions. So we'll have our microphonists stand up and ask.
We can keep talking amongst ourselves up here if you'd rather, but it's more fun if you talk to us and with us.
Absolutely.
So following up on some of the things that Don was saying, the idea of coherence in digital preservation is a very important one to work toward, because there are all of these initiatives going on, not really talking to each other, and I think it'd be really great to have sort of national discussion about how to move forward in these. The next thing is that, in fact, the concept of a trusted digital repository that we've been hanging on to for a while, I think I'm interested in when, how you all are viewing that now, and whether there's any help that you can give us in actually keeping that concept alive in face of Amazon, Glacier and things like that. And then finally, I guess, the storage question. I'm interested to see whether you have leadership that you could give us or opportunities you could give us to think about this gigantic, expensive need that underlies all digital preservation that many of us are not well funded for.
Good to see you. Thanks for that. No, I don't think I can elaborate more on the coherence question, except to say that CLEAR has sort of taken on that problem and has got a national group looking at it. And part of our funding was for them to develop a strategic plan so that it goes beyond that committee, that group of thinkers. On the questions about repositories, Jim raised it this morning, that there's a proliferation of types and kinds of repositories, and there isn't a lot of coherence in that. There's a lot of proliferation of them, certainly. Diversity is a good thing in some ways, and in other ways it becomes a burden to have flowers blooming all over the place and not have ways of differentiating them and aggregating material from them so that people can find and so on. And our funding ended in this area with the development of Fedora and DSpace. So we created the tools, and now I think we need, certainly as a funding agency, we would need to hear more about some ideas about how to bring those into greater coherence. Does every institution need one? Can there be more shared backroom kinds of activities to share those repositories? Hide the, white label the front end for the institution, but actually be using shared repositories in the background. I think some of that work is going on in the press community, where they are facing exactly the same problem, and in some ways on a smaller scale, that if you're going to produce digital monographs, for example, they're going to live online. Not every press wants to build its own repository. So they're struggling with that question now too. And I think your third question about storage relates directly to that, about ways in which you can collaborate to produce efficiencies. And we haven't given a whole lot of thought to any of those questions at this point, I think.
Let me jump in. I've at least two thoughts, though definitely no answers. So sorry. So first, on the question of sort of, you mentioned Amazon Glacier, things like that. We spend a lot of time around the foundation talking about where are things coming out of the market anyways. Where are there things that aren't? And where philanthropic funds particularly need to be focused in order to help to support the creation of public goods, of services that will sort of be of value broadly. That's really how we understand and internally talk about our work. So on one hand, at least from my own experience, what I found is that line has shifted even over the past handful of years. And I again can't offer particular guidance, but to say that it's a challenge we're facing too, understanding as industry moves very quickly and races ahead, understanding when to cut off lines of funding, when to shift to other priorities, but also understanding how to maintain sort of safety nets underneath, and not overly trust, say, industry solutions, even if the herd is so big and moving in such a coherent direction that it's unfathomable that those solutions could just fundamentally be yanked away one day. On your point about funding for storage, the only thing that I'd add to Don's response is it strikes me that there's a particular problem right now, which is the consumers of that storage are pretty strongly insulated from the costs of that storage particularly when provisioned by libraries. I mean, this is a structural problem in libraries in a number of we've seen this in say, subscription literature. And I think, one of the interesting challenges is to figure out how to think about making those costs and trade-offs more tangible, because it seems like libraries are in a really tough situation if they're the sort of universal provisioner of services and goods, but then have to figure out, without the patrons, without the researchers knowing how this all actually gets paid for.
The agency problems.
Exactly. Yeah.
I'm asking a question that may have an answer in this room, it may not. I work in electronic reserves. I've been doing that for 10 years. And one thing I think would benefit from funding, and through collaborative efforts, of course, would be standardization of certain aspects of what I do. For example, persistent links, direct object indicators, some initiative, perhaps, that if funded would ensure that it would be adopted across the board internationally. There had been some mention earlier on scholarship and not being able to get to information because links have disappeared, the link rot. And then I think of other times, other anecdotes where, say, a publisher such as Hayworth gets acquired by someone else, and then all of their documents are inaccessible. And then we have public domain websites, for example, government, NGOs, and such, that publish white papers and such, and those disappear. And of course, we have the Internet Archive, but shouldn't we be spending more on making ensuring that what we have now, not simply institutional repositories, but the actual work that is available through peer-reviewed or through professional organizations be protected? I am constantly renewing and refreshing links that are only 2 years old.
This is a great question, and of course, the good thing about standards is that there's so many of them, and that's part of the problem. What I would suggest, though, is that this is partly a policy question, and it's a big part of it is policy, and having simple things like oversight over the change of websites when they're redesigned and moved to a different platform, paying attention to your own links and how they are migrated to the new platform is something, and I know this is true from the change we just made at Mellon. It was the last thing on the list, and it can't be.
She's telling us.
Oh, it says 1 minute, wrap it up.
Yeah.
So I guess we're wrapping it. Oh,
Jim.
Jim.
This sensation from Jim. Jim giving us this sensation.
So there's been a lot of recent discussion because of work at Carnegie Mellon on the issue of what they call executable content. That being, if a program or an application is developed with a particular software, should a individual who comes later to use that application expect to be able to look at it in the context in which it was developed, that is, the same software, or are we going to expect over time that new software will be written to allow those data to be looked at in the old ways as well as new ways? So I wonder if you reflect very briefly on the whole arena of executable content, and is it a niche issue, or is it something which is increasingly important?
I can start with that. So from my work at Sloan, I'm interested in this for a bunch of different reasons, but my sort of primary move into that area is from looking at what the researchers we're serving and trying to help are doing today and how they're doing their work. And in fact, in the way you framed it, I think, I worry about sort of even a step further where, you look at what a bioinformatics researcher does today. She doesn't have just one application that she uses. Scientific workflows are chained together sequences of of everything from small command line scripts up to sort of very substantial bioinformatics pipelines to visualization software to other things. And if you want to actually be able to understand, just review, much less sort of extend that work, you can't just freeze these things in Amber and treat them as documents. You have to treat them as environments, and you have to be able to do that accordingly. Now that's incredibly hard. And frankly, also, this is sort of what I was trying to get at before, that requires a foothold up into the research process that isn't just about outputs or products. That requires being able to not just have agency with regard to the researchers, but with regard to the environments in which they work, to be able to do that curation and that ultimate preservation upstream. So yeah, that's really the issue to me, and I think there are also a lot of other, frankly, as more and more of our culture exists in mediated by software in one way or another, I worry about not maintaining those systems. But yeah, really, first and foremost, given my sort of primary program at Sloan right now, it's the research context.
Let me say,
Yeah.
go ahead, no, please.
Well, there's just a very brief. We had a convening last year on the National Digital Platform, our funding priority, and one of the most important questions I think that was asked there was, okay, so where does the library platform, if we can even agree that we share a national digital library platform to start to bring coherence to many of these efforts that have been funded over the last 30 years, where do we come up against or enmesh with the commercial platforms and other platforms that exist out there? And that's an example of one of those instances. There are many more.
In response, I would make 2 points. One, I pick up on what Josh just said, which I think is a huge point, and that is our awareness of this problem will grow as scholars become more aware of the issue in their own peer review.
Yes.
And I think that's true in humanities publication as well. Some of the projects we've just funded embed a technical peer review in the review of a digital project that needs to be published. And that review itself has to take account of, okay, what happens 20 years from now when we try to read that book? And so that's the first point. And the second point is that, and I think you will all appreciate this because you often call for foundations to collaborate with one another. The three of us have been working exactly on this problem. After Vince Cerf made his beautiful talk at the AAAS and mentioned the OLIVE project, we have been talking about how to advance that. And what we've done collectively is to commission a review of, and it's the OLIVE project at Carnegie Mellon isn't the only one. There's several others. Internet Archive, there's a project in Germany and so on. Looking at emulation as a solution, and we have a reviewer of those projects to carefully examine what the state of the art in computer engineering is in regards to this process and what the applications are, how we can advance it to a production stage. And so maybe we should end on that high note.
Good job.
Thank you.